Dad History.
But you're right. TikTok is awesome. It's incredible.
I'm wholly impressed with it. And I know for a couple of years, I was probably very resistant. I had heard it's China stealing our data. It's like, well,
maybe they are.
Someone's going to steal our data. Listen, my phone's not that secure. Somebody's going to steal it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the Chinese are going to do with my data. Nothing worse than what the NSA is going to do with it. So I'm not too concerned.
So I love what I love about TikTok. I'm going to compare it to Twitter because I'm not on Facebook anymore because Facebook's a dumpster fire.
No, I'm going to disagree with you there. I think Twitter's the dumpster fire. Facebook is the post-apocalyptic hellscape. Because
that's fair.
There's nothing there. There's nothing on Facebook except for our two relatives who are removed a couple times.
Sure.
Arguing either pro-Trump or anti-Trump or pro-vax or anti-vax. And that's all it is.
Sure.
It's a ghost town. Not quite a MySpace ghost town, but it's a ghost town.
Facebook's a, you're right. It's a post-apocalyptic hellscape. I don't know. I haven't been on it in several years. Maybe it is. I don't know. But what you're describing is exactly why I left Facebook is there's nothing enjoyable on here for me anymore. When Facebook was first created, and it was created for people in college, so you had to have a college email. And it was just this way for friends to make more friends. And hey, who wants to go out Friday night? And everybody be like, I do. Where do you want to go? And you'd have this whole almost live streaming session on how are we going to plan our weekend? Or, hey, here's what I did last weekend. We went on this trip and went camping and here's all the photos, it was all this fun stuff. And now it's just well, here's a meme or a GIF I saw and it's politically based and it, and let's argue about it. Or if you argue with me, I'll block you. I just don't know what the value in it.
Yeah. And so 90% of the people who are friends with me on Facebook are people that I know from my past. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it kind of compares to Twitter. Twitter is, I think, less than 10% of the people on Twitter I have actually met in person that I'm connected with. They're like a whole new group of friends. Now that's a dumpster fire because if you go down the wrong rabbit hole there, it is it's like the worst parts of town.
Mm-hmm.
But it's at least interesting.
It's interesting. And my friend Antoine, a coworker of mine, he got me onto Twitter and he said, you will like Twitter because you will find out anything that's happening 3 days before the rest of the media gets to it, including Facebook. He goes, if you want to know the latest sports info or you want to know the latest news or current events, get a Twitter account, follow those things. And anytime something happens, you'll know about it on Twitter first. And then your grandma will tell you about it a week later on Facebook.
Yeah.
And he's right. That's exactly what happens is I'll find out something on Twitter about, some actor passed away. And then my wife 4 days later be like, did you hear? Yeah, I already processed this 3 days ago. I heard it, dealt with it and moved on.
Well, that's kind of that's
what I love about Twitter.
That's one of the, I guess, tropes of Twitter is that when somebody's name pops up in trending,
who died
everybody's
now?
First response is, it's, Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
They're not dead. They're not dead.
Yeah.
By the way, welcome to Dad Bod After Dark. So we don't have anything else prepared. We're just gonna let all that roll.
Where the beer is cold and the takes are old.
Yes, and tonight it's lemon water.
Yeah. Got to keep your voice.
Yeah.
Got to keep the.
And by the way, as much as we're dumping on Facebook, go to facebook.com/dadbodhistory.
We still love the followers.
We love them. And, we're on Twitter and we are now on TikTok. We're actually putting something
So the validity of Twitter, and I still appreciate it for this, although I do find myself, especially when it was the election season, getting really drawn into those dark rabbit holes. And even if it was like stuff that you agreed with, you're like, man, I can't pull myself out of this. And I get that's social media. That's what they want to do. But TikTok, and maybe because it's newer, but it's so refreshing. And the rabbit holes are there. Like you can't help it. Like you're just diving into stuff, but like it's almost edifying and it's almost it is educational in many respects.
Far more than Twitter.
Oh yeah.
So the funny thing on Twitter is I have my personal account. I have our Dad Bod History account, twitter.com/dadbodhistory, or at Dad Bod History. Two wildly different sets of people, because on Twitter, well, my personal account, I try to cast a wide net, and I have several sets of kind of, so I have this whole kind of handful times 10 people that I follow that are just of the libertarian slant. Mm-hmm. And there's a good chunk of them that they don't use a real name, but they use an intentional and important name, and they use an image like a classical liberal person, and they post things, and they're usually trolling, but it's this interesting kind of troll. For some reason, I ended up following a bunch of Catholics on Twitter, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, and then tie that in with like the Protestants, especially like Lutherans, and some of those rabbit holes. Again, they use different names. They use either names that are tied to Catholicism and the Latin Mass, or like old Lutherans or whatever it is. And then those images, it is this deep dive hole into, the debate that I always see is, and I'm trying to think of the official name for it, but it is the perpetual virginity of Mary and the veneration of Mary as being like the central issue, because you have Catholics who hold it so dear, and then you have some Protestants, especially like Lutheran Protestants, who are like, nope, no, sorry. If you do that, it's heresy. And then the Catholics come back and say, well, if you don't, it's heresy. And by the end of, the old Godwin's law of everything devolves into Hitler, that actually never happens there. It all, in Catholic and Lutheran Twitter, it devolves not to Hitler, but to you are condemned to hell.
Sure. Well, the one thing that's more serious than Hitler is condemned to hell. Yeah. I mean, that's the last step is.
So, and then, I follow plenty of people who are on the far left as well, that are fascinating follows, and I can have a genuine conversation with, and people that I've followed and followed me back due to a disagreement in which one of us ended up being corrected on a point. And that has been really good. But the engagement level compared to TikTok, and I was very resistant to TikTok.
Compared to Twitter, you mean?
TikTok compared to Twitter. Sorry.
Yep.
It's just a different thing.
And what's so fascinating is that the content that's being created. So somebody will create a piece of original content, right? And then people will watch it, like it, and comment on it. And then the creator will make a new piece of content replying to one of those comments. Right. And so you get this whole discourse happening, in one respect via comment, and then in the other respect via a new video replying and expounding upon. And it's not always a disagreement. Sometimes it's, hey, I was wondering about this. And then somebody will reply, and then you reply back to that. And it's just like this whole like weird like engagement dynamic where it
encourages the Q&A thing, which I've seen a couple of times. It encourages questions and actual discussion, which is odd because it's in video form, which gives it this extra step, which is one of the problems we've had is like, how do we take that step into actually making this 30-second, 1 minute, 3 minute piece of content, it shouldn't be that tough.
Mm-hmm.
But people do it and they do it really well. And I think I'd like us to get it there. There's a few of the people that I know we follow on there. Mini Minuteman is a particular favorite of mine. Anthropology and archaeology, does some pretty hilarious stuff. I forget the name of the guy that you followed.
Stukui. Yeah.
He does a lot of history stuff. And some of those are fascinating. And I know
it's funny because he's shown green screens of his draft videos. I mean, they come out, he does a lot of them, but he puts a ton of work into them, and he's got a lot of stuff that he works on for a while. So it's not as effortless as the final product looks. But the point is, it creates this discourse. And what's great about it is like that guy, Stukui is his account. I think his name is Steven. I saw one of his videos and I replied to it and created my own little discussion. I'm like, here's why I think this is interesting. And it's one of those things where it really encourages you to say, yeah, go ahead and reply to other creators' content. Go ahead and stitch it or duet it and make your own spin on it. And it's just so revolutionary. Instagram is trying with their reels, but the reels are only 30 seconds long, and they don't encourage the interactiveness of TikTok. It's something I've never seen before, and it's awesome. And I think don't get us wrong, TikTok can be just as toxic as the rest of social media. It gets bad. But
I think that's probably something that turned me off in the first week of really using TikTok recently. Yeah. Is I'm scrolling through and I'm legitimately having to say, is scrolling through this going to be bad for me? Because I'm trying to find good content. I'm trying to find stuff that interests me, makes me laugh, makes me curious, makes me ask questions. And, it's all the stuff that doesn't, I think we know where we're going. It's borderline, inappropriate, I guess, is just how we'll leave it. But, at this point now I scroll through and that stuff doesn't pop up. It's learned you're not interested in this. There's plenty of sports stuff that's come up, history stuff.
There's a channel. I don't know if it's a channel. There's a creator, and all he does is pool ball racing. And so he takes a set of pool balls, like cue ball and 1 through 15, and he puts them on a treadmill.
Yeah.
And then he just races them. He's like, oh, here comes the 5. He's coming up. He's going to keep going. Oh, the 2's about to fall. Oh no, he recovers. Yeah. He drops cups. It's awesome. It's and I just can't stop watching it. And you can play prop bets and
okay. Now that's interesting because the pool balls are all essentially the same except for the color, right? And he throws other things in there to mix it up. There's another one, treadmill guys, where they do cars, like Matchbox cars.
I've seen those too. And he puts little team names or logos on the cars.
And it just and I'm like, this is way more fascinating than it should be.
Yeah.
But the kind of stuff that I've ended up following is just, it's all over the place, but it's things that interest me. And those things keep coming up. When I log out or I come back later, it goes over to my For You page and I'm just going through new stuff that does interest me because it's kind of got me, Lord of the Rings TikTok is these people are talking about things. In fact,
New Better Do Better is one of the greatest Lord of the Rings accounts ever.
I had to make a purchase because what I have is in storage. So I had to buy this because I'm watching those videos. I'm like, I don't know the stuff from the Silmarillion from before.
Can we talk about that? Because I've read the Silmarillion and it's good. Don't get me wrong, it's good, but I've
never made it into past the first few things.
Different
like the Valaquenta
than the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's like the Venerable Bedes.
Genesis.
It's very good. It's like reading Genesis, but 1,000 pages. It's like reading the Venerable Bede, History of England, or the Gesta Danorum, the history of the Norse people and Ragnar Lodbrok. It's a chronicle. It's not a story. It's a chronicle of Middle Earth. And so there's parts of it you're just like,
well,
there's huge gaps because it's thousands of years, but then there's also like really intense moments within that. It's just very different.
So the first part, which is Anulindale, the music of the Anur, and I'm pronouncing it, and then it goes to Valaquenta, and the first part of the Valaquenta is just a retelling of the first part. But here's the funny thing: is I also downloaded the audiobook because I wanted to listen to it in the car, and I knew that was a mistake because I need to see a lot of these names because guess what? They're not pronounced the way I'm pronouncing them. What's the other name for Eru?
Iluvatar, right?
Yeah, that's not how it's pronounced by the guy who reads it. It's Iluvatar.
Gosh, see,
like it's still Ilu, but it's Vatar.
So one of these TikTok videos,
like, what the?
I can't remember her name. She's really good too, but she said it's you know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Hannah
one of the
Hannah Robb.
Yeah, I think so. And she said Gimli, son of Gloin, is actually Gimli, son of Glowin. And I'm like, what? And like she did a whole 3-minute video.
Well, how'd you pronounce it? Gloin?
Gloin. Like one syllable, Gloin. And she's like, no, it's Glowin. And she explained why. And I'm like, I had no idea. I've been pronouncing his name wrong for decades. So anyway, what are we talking about? Yeah, we can eat that. We're talking about TikTok. Silmarillion. Anyway, it's good. Yeah. It's just different. And I can see why. Are you
talking about TikTok or Silmarillion now?
Both. Okay. They're both different. But
they're both good and different.
Silmarillion is different than Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so I really enjoyed it when I read it the first time. But I tried to start reading it again maybe a year ago. And I'm like, God, this is hard to get into. Like I forgot how hard it was to get into. But I know if I were to start it again, if I could get through that initial first part, it really becomes captivating.
And so now I know, I'm sure you've seen this. There was a whole like the unfinished tales and the histories of Middle Earth that were released probably 15, 20 years ago. And now they're releasing these other books like The Children of Hurin. You've probably seen. There's another one, Beren and Luthien. The Fall of Gondolin, which are these like standalone tales that go into more detail that are written more of a novel style, I suppose. And there's another one that's called The Nature of Middle Earth that came out like a week ago. And it's about how Middle Earth works, like the rules, like how the world works. And somebody in a TikTok video pointed out that in The Nature of Middle Earth, it talks about the Undying Lands. Time actually moves slower. And Tolkien laid out how time moves differently in the Undying Lands. This person had mentioned that Frodo goes to the Undying Lands, Sam stays, lives another 60 years until Rose dies, and then he goes to the Undying Lands. Well, for Frodo, for Sam, it would have been 60 years. For Frodo, it felt like 1 month in the Undying Lands, which is just kind of this odd thing. And so those are some other books I want to get. I want to read some of these other stories because I know these are what they're pulling from to make that new Amazon series that comes out in a year. So
speaking of the Amazon series, I finally watched the trailer for Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
Watch it with Bree and looks good. I've been tempering my enthusiasm for this show. One, because I think it's taken about as long to make this show as it took Robert Jordan to posthumously finish the series. Like that's.
Well, he's not the one.
Well, I know. I mean, well, it was finished. I mean, Brandon Sanderson finished it, but like, I'm just really tempered myself. I'm like, okay, yeah, this show's coming out. And then I saw it. I'm like, well, and I was like, oh, well, that's Lan. Okay, there's Matt Koth and that's Perrin.
Yeah.
There's Rand Althor. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, that must be a Egwene. And obviously Moraine was easy to pick out. And like when they showed Tarvalon, I'm like, okay, they've at least captured what my mind's eye was imagining as far as the settings go.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. Like I had this grand idea of what Tarvalon was, but I also had this idea of the Two Rivers and like these like kind of like thatched adobe type houses. And there they were. And like, it was just like, oh yeah, this is what my mind has been picturing for
I think the images of Tarvalon for me were not they weren't disappointing, but it was not what I imagined. I imagined the tower was this massive tower, like unfathomably tall for that world. And the tower that they show it's a tower. It's big, but it's nothing. It didn't seem to capture the size that I thought of.
It's funny. Of course,
they did the same thing in Game of Thrones, because the wall in the north is supposed to be 7 miles high or something. Like it's just, and it's not, because that's a ridiculously high wall. So
yeah, nobody could live on a wall that was 7 miles high. Yeah, it's impossible.
So
yeah, it's interesting. It's funny is the Aes Sedai, because they're supposed to be ageless. And so I was looking like, well, they're not ageless. And I'm like, I don't know how you'd make an ageless Aes Sedai. I think you just kind of got to deal with them. Like, well, yeah, because we don't actually have ageless humans. We need to just go with what we got. And
except for Keanu Reeves.
Except for Keanu.
And Paul Rudd.
Yeah. And Nicolas Cage may have been reincarnated. We're not sure. Yeah. There's like those old timey photos of Nicolas Cage. But yeah, Paul. So if they have male Aes Sedai, they need to get Paul Rudd and Keanu Reeves when the Black Tower is built.
Oh yeah,
that's got to be your Logain.
Oh yeah,
and your who's the other false dragon? The one that was evil.
Mazrim Taim.
That's So Mazrim Taim. That'll be
they've already cast Logain. So
have they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep in mind, exactly a year ago, I gave The Wheel of Time to a 7th grader, and he finished the series in February.
That's a lot of reading.
I gave the series to a 6th grader last month, and she's into The Dragon Reborn right now.
It's a book 4. Okay.
No, 3.
Oh yeah. Shadow Rising.
So and it's just like, man, I didn't start reading those till college.
You were the one that got me into it.
Yeah. And Nick had gotten me into it. And it took me 2 tries to get into Eye of the World. Mm-hmm. When I finally got into it, I tried it in high school, quit, got into it in college, my freshman year. And then I was reading it. One of my freshman roommates, Jim, he had read most of it. But of course, I didn't finish it until 2014 when the final book came out. So that took me 15 years.
I had to read when the final book came out. I had to reread every book so I could remember, because it'd been so long, and it was awesome. It was still great the second time through, all 13 other books. But what is it? Eye of the World, The Great Hunt, and Dragon Reborn are quite possibly 3 of the best fantasy books of all time. Like they're up there.
Very good.
And Shadow Rising was good, and the other books are good, but there's definitely peaks and valleys after that. But those first 3 were incredible.
Those 3 were like probably my first real foray into fantasy. I had read like the Drizzt Do'Urden series before that.
Oh yeah.
Salvatore. And those are good. They were fun. But this was the first time I'd really dive deep. Mm-hmm. When I finished that series, the last 3 books, I don't think they could have picked anyone better than Brandon Sanderson to finish it out. But those last 3 books were like a powerhouse finish. Like Robert Jordan had laid this groundwork over so many books, maybe too many in the middle. Mm-hmm. But when you finally got those finishes and those threads being pulled together, and it was a heck of a payoff. I'd say it ranks up there with like Endgame as a great.
That's
payoff.
A great way to put it. Yeah, that's a great way to compare it. Is The Wheel of Time is just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe in that there's all these disparate threads. I mean, there's this obviously underlying theme, and there's movies that aren't good. I think Winter's Heart was not my favorite book, and I don't think it passed much time in world.
It was like a week.
Yeah. So you could compare Winter's Heart to like Thor, The Dark World. You know what I mean? Like Marvel had a couple misses in there, but overall the culmination was awesome. And the last books that Sanderson did to finish it off based on Jordan's outlines and notes was incredible. Like it was emotional for me to finish reading those.
Oh, and what I guess I kind of love about it is that I can hand it off to a 6th or 7th grader and I don't have to worry about content as far as there being an issue. It really, there was nothing in there that I could find objectionable.
Oh, well-turned ankles. I mean, Rand had some very well-turned ankles. I mean, there were some sex scenes, but they were all like, it was like off-screen sex, and then they had sex.
Yeah, it was, it was tastefully done. Nothing like Game of Thrones, which was, and again, I think Game of Thrones is very enjoyable. The series, the book series.
Yeah, but you can't give it to a middle schooler.
No, you can't. And there's plenty of dystopian and fantasy series that they don't pass that muster, where this is like probably one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. Mm-hmm. And it does so without having to pull that stuff in. And man, it was so enjoyable. So I'm really looking forward to the series. They've started writing the 2nd season. Well,
and something I've held for a while now is that television series, especially like Amazon or HBO, those are the best format for stuff like this. The problem with the Dark Tower movie, and I liked it, it was not, you can't get into the Dark Tower in a 2-hour movie, with Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, who I think they did a good job.
So can you imagine a Stephen King cinematic universe where Matthew McConaughey is the Man in Black?
It would be awesome.
And Idris Elba is the gunslinger. And like, I'm sorry.
Well, and then you're pulling in Salem's Lot. Then you've got, The Stand. Like you've got all these, because it's all connected.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's only connected by just a tiniest thread or it's woven together,
and
it's all connected.
I wish I knew how Stephen King has kind of sold the different rights, because I know CBS has a TV show called The Stand. I watched a few episodes, couldn't really get into it. But these are like, there's this potential for a Stephen King shared universe where you do have some common threads of characters that be through the whole thing. Idris Elba as the gunslinger was brilliant. I loved it. And I really enjoyed that movie, but I also know that I went and saw that with my partner teacher and my wife, and I could tell they were lost.
Yeah.
It just didn't, there wasn't enough time to set it up right.
Exactly.
And I know that it was like a second iteration for the Dark Tower, right? There was the horn was actually present.
Well, it was the movie that followed the coda.
Right.
But you have to have read the 7 other books and the coda to understand what the heck they're doing in this movie. Like, and it was a big letdown. It's like, like I said, I liked it, but I can totally see why people who had not read the books would be like, what did I just watch?
Yeah. It didn't seem to fit. Mm-hmm. And man, I look forward to something. And I think they have a Dark Tower series on deck at Amazon or somewhere to remake it, restart it. But I just know they're not going to get Idris Elba, probably not going to get Matthew McConaughey. And I was just, what a waste. Because those two. Dennis
Haysbert was Roland's dad.
Yeah.
He was good.
My gosh. That scene was.
Yeah.
And I have the big, I guess it is a box set of the comic books for the Dark Tower, which are all his past, all the past of the gunslinger of Roland Deschain.
Yeah.
Kind of the stuff that's covered in Wizard and Glass, but even more so. And it's really well done.
I think I remember reading the first few of those from you when you got them, and they were good. Those were really good.
But it's these 2 big, thick books, and one is all the comic books, and the second one is like a massive glossary. Mm-hmm. They're the same size.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit disappointing, but that happens.
No, I agree. I mean, it's the way of things, but I do like that these big companies like Amazon and HBO and Netflix are taking on these literary series and saying, well, let's see what we can do with it.
Yeah.
I haven't read Shadow and Bone. I haven't watched it, but I've heard it's really good.
So that, my wife and I started watching that. I think she's read the series, or we have students who read the series. There's some content in there that I'm not fond of, but it's a fascinating world because it's basically pre-World War I Russia is the setting, is what I forget some of the names, but the culture is Russian, and there's this magic that's set in there. And then you have this other group of people that are obviously, based on kind of an Asian culture that they're at war with. But there's also this, like this massive shadow across their land that separates the two sides of this Russian-like world. And I'm thinking, well, that's Siberia, separating the western part of Russia, the civilized part, with the frontier. It's an interesting setup. Again, it's based on a bunch of, older teenagers. There's some weird threads that are out there that kind of confuse me, and I'm not sure how they connect, but it's an interesting world. I kind of want to finish the first season, but haven't gotten around to it yet. So.
Well, yeah, no. And but I think that's just another example of, you can do things like that a lot better in the long form storytelling than you can in movies, even good movies. I think there's a lot of good movies out there that are based on book series, but you play devil's advocate in your mind. You're like, how much better could this have been if it was a Game of Thrones type show? I think Harry Potter is up there. I think you could do something with the Hunger Games, stuff like that as well. I mean, there's just so many options out there. You're like, man, it was good. I liked what I saw, but it could have been more, which is why I'm interested to see how this Lord of the Rings First Age show on Amazon is going to be. One, because it's going to be the first age, so it's going to be Silmarillion based, but it's also like Peter Jackson knocked it out of the park with Lord of the Rings, the movie. So that's your bar, Amazon, that you have to hit if you want to keep people engaged. Like, yeah,
he hit that out of the park and then made almost a dud with The Hobbit.
Yeah. It's like he did everything that worked in Lord of the Rings. He did the opposite of in The Hobbit. Too much CGI. He added too much stuff to the story that wasn't relevant, to the plot. Like, it's like, well, let's see if we can stretch this out. And it's like, no, you could have made one really good movie. You didn't have to make 3 so-so movies. But
right.
All right. So what else do you want to talk about? I was
so
weren't really prepared, which is fine.
We weren't. So this was it kind of crept up on me on Friday. It was September 10th, and some of my students are like, are we going to talk about 9/11 at history? And I was like, I honestly hadn't thought too much about it. I hadn't planned on it. Because I don't know what to tell 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds who are they're removed from it. And I honestly don't know how to discuss it with them. I recounted my experience on 9/11 in my dorm room. And outside, like that was my experience, was watching it on TV and having, my father was a pilot. So I was a little bit freaked out about that until I realized, I found out he was home. And I recounted the series of events is still very concrete in my mind.
So it's interesting, right? Because it's been 20 years, right? as of yesterday, it's been 20 years since 9/11 happened. And in that 20 years, an entire generation has been born, a whole new generation that has grown up under the cloud of 9/11, that, and the war on terror, more broadly speaking. And as of August 30th, 31st, the war on terror has come to a, if not end, a much reduced scope. And so now you have possibly a beginning of a new generation that's going to grow up even more removed from the events of 9/11. But like you said, like when I remember it, my roommate came back into my room and said, "Hey, the two towers just got knocked down." Like, I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, some planes hit the two towers and they're gone. And so I turned on the TV and like the world stopped for us that day.
Yeah.
Like, and it stayed stopped for a week, right? Like the stock markets were shut down. All the flights were grounded. Like everything froze for a week while the world came to grips with that. And that was, it was surreal. And I don't know if I'll ever be I hope, I don't know if I will be in an experience quite like that again, where the world froze to process this shared tragedy,
The only thing I can compare it to is COVID, but COVID wasn't like a sucker punch that stunned you and had you reeling. It's just been this rolling disaster.
The only way I can think of it is the sudden loss of a loved one.
Yeah.
Like on a smaller scale, if you heard, and we've all had loss in our life, but when you have that, you're just going through a normal day and then you get a phone call and you hear that whomever passed away, and you're kind of dumbfounded and you can't really like process like what's happening. Like, no, that's not real. Like what I'm seeing on the TV right now, I know that's not real. Like I couldn't understand what I was watching with the video of those planes slamming into the towers. Like that didn't happen. Like and eventually once I accepted that it happened, then I started to like process like my emotions. And like the first one was like indignant, like anger. And then like I wanted to get the people that did this to us.
Yeah.
And then like this swelling of love and pride of country. And the way I can compare it, like I said, is like the loss of a loved one. Like, no. They're not gone. They're still here. And once you finally do it, like once you finally accept that, no, that person's gone, then you start going through the stages of grief, and like denial, and then like whatever. I don't know what the 5 stages of grief are, but like that's, wasn't like bargaining one of them. I don't know what it is, but like that's what you're going through. And that's like America, and to a lesser extent, the world is like going through the 5 stages of grief, like after the shock. And here we are now 20 years later, but it is very interesting because I'm not teaching anymore, but everyone is like, on Twitter largely was saying, oh, things for 9/11. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's 9/11. Like I hadn't thought about it, but I'm like, wow, it's been 20 years.
Some people definitely, maybe cling is the wrong word, but I'll use it. Cling to this date and cling to this event in the same way that people might cling to June 6th or December 7th. This date matters. And I think about it, and I'm not sure that I don't want to be posting on Facebook or Twitter anywhere like December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. I can't post that and be genuine. And I saw plenty of people posted a ton of stuff on Facebook about 9/11. And I'm not sure how to approach it. Because when I discussed it with my students, they asked, and I said, we were about to head off to chapel that morning. And I said, no, we're not going to take time at history because I don't really know how to talk to you about it because you weren't alive. I don't know how to explain it. I'll tell you in 5 minutes what I experienced, and described watching the buildings because both planes had hit before I turned on the TV. But of course, we got to see it over and over and over. Got to see people jumping out, watch them collapse.
That was tough.
And I find this weird detachment from it because I can't, if I sit in it too long, if I think about it too much, there's this kind of like this very dark horror that overcomes me of what that must have been like. And I can't go there. We walked yesterday here in town. We have a beam with concrete from the Twin Towers that was placed in a memorial at one of our fire departments here. So they had this big memorial yesterday. So we went down there and my 8-year-old son starts asking me about it because we were picking up my daughter from there. She was with a friend and I'm trying to explain it to him. And I find that there's moments that I couldn't actually get the words out because I was struggling to keep my emotions in check. Because I'm trying to explain to him, these people took these planes over and they used them as weapons and they hit these towers and it killed a lot of people. And then I get to the point where I'm explaining that a bunch of firefighters and police officers just went into the buildings. And that's where I really struggled because that still never registers correctly with me or doesn't register completely. Because that story, it's the simplest story in the whole thing, is that these buildings were in danger of collapsing. And these firefighters and police officers just went straight into them.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get through that sentence without having to stop a couple times, trying to explain to my 8-year-old son without horrifying him. And of course, he's been on this Titanic kick the last week and a half too. So I don't think he's too distant from disasters. It's just, I still struggle to comprehend. And I have watched things over the years and I've never watched a documentary all the way through on it, except for one, but I can't sit there and watch and try to relive this whole thing about how awful it was on the inside. I just can't.
I think it's interesting because for us, and for me personally, it's this weird flux of history because it's been 20 years. Like I said, there's a whole generation of people that didn't live through this. But then it's also, for me, a mix of it is something I lived through. And to be fair, tangentially, I didn't know anybody that was in the towers or on those planes. I didn't, I'm not even sure if I know anybody that knew anybody that was, but it was something that America and the world experienced collectively 20 years ago.
In real time.
This
wasn't like Kennedy being shot and it being reported on the news 20 minutes or an
Pearl
hour
Harbor.
later.
Yeah.
Or Pearl Harbor, which was reported in the hours afterwards.
But that's a great way but that's perfect though, is because I remember my mom talking to me about the Kennedy assassination. Like her and her mom, like it collected newspaper clippings and like that was something that they lived and they were like trying to explain it to me. Like, oh, well, that's bad. Like I understood that was bad as a kid, like that our president was killed, and then the whole thing with the Lee Harvey Oswald stuff, but like I didn't feel it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And now with 9/11, it's like I felt it and I remember how it messed with me emotionally. But now it's been 20 years and there's this whole generation of people that they understand what happened on 9/11 was bad. But they're like, yeah, that's bad. And it's like, no, you don't get it. Like, it's more than it was bad. Like, it was devastating at the time.
Yeah.
And I think, but I've also personally, like in my own mind, I've kind of put 9/11 in its own compartment in my brain. And I just kind of go, yeah, it's this traumatic thing I remember and lived through, but I don't access that. Like, I don't intentionally like bring it up. And that's just kind of how I am with a lot of trauma in my life. I don't bring it up, but I it's there and it's kind of in its own compartment. But when people ask or like, as we're talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, it did bring up all these thoughts and emotions when it happened. And so it's like, I kind of reaccess that, but anyway,
I'd say the only documentary that I watched all the way through, because all of them are really focused on the attacks themselves. And I just can't do that,
Yeah.
Is 9 Innings from Ground Zero, which really is about the New York Yankees following the attacks and then into the World Series, which happened to be the Arizona Diamondbacks beating the New York Yankees in probably one of the best World Series of all time. And it's a fascinating documentary because it talks about just not the attacks themselves, but this kind of like these concentric circles around the attacks and people who were affected, but also into baseball and how it all interconnects. It's really interesting. And I really enjoyed that documentary. And I think that's the only documentary that I've ever showed to students. But
and I think that's
right,
funny.
I don't access that stuff.
But it is interesting because the moments, I mean, obviously I'll remember watching the videos of the planes hitting, but those videos will be played from here until the end of time, just like the videos of the Pearl Harbor, the black and white Pearl Harbor videos. Like those are, or the videos from D-Day or Kennedy being shot. But that's real quick. But that's not what I think about when I do think about 9/11. What I think about is when George Bush went to Ground Zero and he stood on the pile of rubble and people saying, we can't hear you. And he said, well, I can hear you. And pretty soon the whole world can hear you. And pretty soon the people that did this to us, they're going to hear from all of us. Like, that's what I remember. Like, it's those other moments, or the guy on Flight 93 calling his wife and he goes, all right, we got to go, let's roll. And that was it. And then like, those are the things that I'll access. And those are the things that I'll remember and go like, yeah, that was a terrible day. And the weeks after it were terrible. But there's these little glimmers, or the firefighters and police officers running in when everyone else is running out. Like, and much like Pearl Harbor, like there's these moments of valor and beauty in this terrible event. And we can discuss the war on terror and all the fallout from that separate. And I think you should talk about that in some sense separately, because you can divorce the war on terror from 9/11 and say, yes, the war on terror was a mistake and how we operated was wrong. But there's these other moments of heroism and greatness to get lost if you just say, well, the whole war on terror was a waste of time. It's like, no, or even if it was, you don't want to miss these other things that happened that were bright in a dark time.
Yeah, because you can then kind of work yourself backwards and say, well, here's why 9/11 happened. And it's because of these policies. Like, stop. Because aside from this, our government's various conflicting policies over decades that have had negative consequences.
Sure.
We're not
well, you diminish.
We're not removed from it enough to actually do that. When we always joke, too soon. It's too soon.
Yeah.
To say Yeah, no, it's not like we're talking about the 1840s and 50s and saying how these events all led to this event, led to this election in 1860 and led to secession in 1861. And, it's not academic.
Mm-hmm.
For most people, you can't, that academic discussion can exist, but you have to divorce it from the event and those details you're talking about.
Well, and you diminish the heroism of those firefighters and police. You diminish you can hate George Bush as a president, but in that moment, I probably never loved my country more than when he stood on that pile of rubble with that firefighter and said those words. Like, that's an honest to God truth. I think he made a ton of mistakes after that, but in that moment, he said exactly what I needed to hear. And I think if you just say, well, Bush is terrible. Okay, sure. Great. He is. But there was this moment, and I think we diminish those moments by lumping it all together and saying, well, this, and then whatever our conclusion is.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing I was going to say is because, our generation looks back on the Kennedy video, right? And the Zapruder film. We look back on the D-Day film, and it's really fascinating. When some videos were shown this past week of events on 9/11, I was watching them and it's like, these aren't in HD.
It's so true.
These aren't in 4K. And I'm looking at them like, this is a 20-year-old video. This is old.
Yeah.
If I was watching something on TV with this quality of film today, I wouldn't, like, if sports came on and this was the quality of film that we had 20 years ago and it was shown to me today, I wouldn't accept it. I'd be like, no, I need HD. I need 4K. Like, this isn't good enough.
It is pretty. Go ahead.
You're looking at people and they're pulling out cell phones, but they're flip phones. They're all flip phones. There's not an iPhone in sight.
There's the video of I hear this young woman's voice as they're watching the second plane slam into the tower, and they had this video of them filming it, because they saw the first tower burning, and I think they're in an apartment or a hotel or whatever, looking on the balcony, and I'm like, who had a camera at this time? Because cell phones were not ubiquitous in America, and especially phones with cameras.
Oh yeah.
Recording, like cameras that can record. Like, so somebody had like
camcorder,
a video recorder. Well,
a handheld.
Like, they're like, go get the camcorder. We got to get this on film. And I'm not saying like they're doing that in a narcissistic or, paparazzi type way, but like, they're like what's so ubiquitous for now is like, oh, any event we see, we immediately turn our phone on. But back then, like, that was an exception. The fact that we got that video from that random woman.
Yeah. Can you imagine the amount of video coverage we would have on that event if it happened today? Well, look at Beirut a year ago with the explosion in the harbor. There were like 17 different videos because there's probably more than that many people saw the smoke and were like, well, this is interesting enough to take video of. And I've got unlimited video. If it turns out to be a nothing burger, I can just delete it. But look at the smoke. And then it explodes. So we had like dozens of angles on that massive explosion. And in New York City in 2001, the first plane, I don't know how many videos there are of the first plane. I know there's at least one. It's the firefighters who are doing a training exercise. Mm-hmm. They hear a plane and they point the camera up right as the first plane hits. And again, it's camcorder quality.
Yeah.
But still, all of that in my head is in HD. And I think for the generations that lived through Kennedy, it's in their mind HD. And it's because when they see the things in those videos, like those kind of cars and those kind of clothing, they saw that in everyday life. So they can fill it in, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's kind of an odd little.
No, it makes perfect sense aside. Because that's exactly how I saw it. When the tower came down and the people were running and the smoke and dust was billowing, like it was as if I was in an IMAX theater. And I wasn't. I was in my dorm room on a couch watching it on a 27 TV that maybe, whatever the pixels were back then. Like, but in my mind,
it was real.
Still see it right now,
clear
as if I was there.
And I can imagine people that saw video of Pearl Harbor, especially videos after, it had the same effect because they're seeing young men in uniform, and they've seen those uniforms in real life in front of their eyes. So all the details and gaps that the quality of the film leaves out, they fill in with their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see these videos from 9/11, I find it almost humorous to myself that the quality of film from 20 years ago is a far cry from what we have today, but that's not how I remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a strange thing.
It is. It is amazing how far we've gone from just in video technology, from Pearl Harbor to Kennedy to 9/11 to today, right? Like, it's inconceivably far, the leaps. And, it's just, but you're right. Like, I've seen videos, I'm like, gosh, that's so, not so much 9/11, but like old sports videos from old, I say old.
Yeah.
But
from 2000.
From 2000. I'm like, gosh, the quality is so bad. But when I remember watching it, like I remember when the Packers won the Super Bowl in 96, I remember watching it and I'm like, this is the clearest picture ever. There's no way the technology is ever going to get better than this, whatever this is.
Yeah.
And now I watch and I'm like, gosh, how could I ever watch anything back then? So yeah, it's a very interesting point.
We survived.
Somehow
we survived the bad technology.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point, is that, like you said, for me, it kind of snuck up on me. Like, I really hadn't thought about 9/11, especially that it was 20 years until I saw a bunch of social media posts. I'm like, oh yeah, it is 9/11. It's just not something I bring to mind unless it's brought to my mind.
Yeah. And there's some people that I could tell had been thinking about it a lot in the weeks leading up to it. Obviously, people were planning events, so those people had it on their mind. Other people just seemed to have it, here's this big event coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And as one of my students said, she said to another student, she said, is this a holiday? I said, no, I don't. That's not how we categorize it. First of all, because we don't get the day off. Second of all, because I think it's just a National Day of Remembrance might be the official title. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, just like Pearl Harbor, it would be a day of remembrance. But yeah, it's been wild. 20 years, man. That's just crazy to think how the time has gone by. So, anything else that you want to go over or discuss, man?
I don't know.
If not, I have two questions for you.
Oh, okay. And
it's something because when we had Jack Peterson on, he asked us this question when we were discussing Starship Troopers. I go, so I broke the question into two. So I'm going to ask you the first one. As of today, what is the greatest nation on Earth currently? So currently existing? Yeah, currently existing. So you can't say the Roman Empire because they no longer exist. The question is, I don't know what great means. Well, and that's why I'm asking. So what do you define great as? And then we can answer who is great. So what does great mean also goes into what are the things that you value? Sure. Absolutely. I think some of the things that I value are things like liberty. Individual liberty is the individual liberty to be in charge of your own agency
to the greatest extent possible is a value that I hold.
Mm-hmm.
Another value that I hold is peace and order, because we can't be absolutely chaotic in our dealings with other people. I generally think that the more free you are to make your own choices, generally human behavior will lead to good mutual outcomes, but oftentimes it will be abused.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to not say the United States is that greatest country, because it has the potential to provide prosperity and order and freedom to as many people as possible, given those constraints. Because while people will be free and will be prosperous, not everyone will be as prosperous as the most.
So you bring up an interesting point with your freedom, like being the first value, because I think there's countries, Ireland being one, the Republic of Ireland being one, that, like, if you look at the indexes or whatever, they are more free than we are. They have more liberty economically. Yeah. They have more economic freedom. And as a result, you could say that people have more freedom. Now, do they have a declared Bill of Rights? No. I mean, that's a very unique American thing. But I think there's other countries out there where you could say these people are more free. However, America's economic standing and military power allow us to have the potential to help people achieve liberty far more than Ireland ever could. They just don't have the might to do it. And I'm not talking about might in a let's go prosecute a war in some far off land. I mean, one of the big reasons there have been no European wars in almost 80 years now, right? Or almost 80 years, is because America guarantees the free trade of the world's seas. Our Navy ensures that the seaways are open, and so that Britain, France, and Germany don't have to fight each other to ensure their trade. We said, we got it. We'll cover you. So you guys don't have to worry about this anymore. We're going to guarantee that the seas are safe and that you guys can trade and build up your economy. So you can spend all your money, building up your industry and removing the primary reason that you guys would fight each other. And that's something that America, and probably only America, could do. Now that's landscape is changing, but that's what's guaranteed the almost century of peace as far as the European continent goes, and North America as well, and much of Southeast Asia, depending on what country we're talking about. So in that regard, it could say, America is the greatest nation on the world because we've guaranteed the safety of hundreds of millions of others around the world through our Navy. And as a result, we indirectly promoted democracy and liberty in many of those nations. Now there's many other nations where we totally interfered. We totally interfered with their ability to be free, and in some cases actively went against that to achieve, our own economic interests. But I would agree with that statement that America has the ability within itself for people to be free, although we've got our own domestic issues with that. And our actions since the 1940s have given Europe an era of freedom or peace that it hasn't had since Rome. and stability that it hasn't had since the Roman Empire, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So one thought that consistently occurs to me is that idea of freedom. Because I know, I'm almost certain we've mentioned it on this podcast, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Mm-hmm.
In order to reach that self-realization, self-actualization, which I think is necessary to actually take on that freedom, to self-actualize that freedom and embrace it and use it and make it worthwhile. Mm-hmm. You need to have all those needs met.
Yeah.
So I'd say in the United States, a good portion of our society has those needs met all the way through. There's plenty that don't. So the question is, can we say that we are securing freedom if people's needs are not met? And that's sometimes where I struggle against my, I guess, libertarian sensibilities. And I would lean into what does the social fabric need to do in order to meet everyone's needs? And one of the issues, and I know there's some people that have brought this up.
What are the needs? What is it? Food, shelter, water.
Shelter. But then also, I mean, once you get above that baseline, if somebody can't get to self-actualization, they can't be free. Like that's required to be free. And the other thing is to be culturally literate. And I know that goes into something with E.D. Hirsch, who the whole core knowledge, not common core curriculum, core knowledge curriculum, is we all have to be speaking the same language. You have to be talking about the same things. Real quick,
the physiological needs, the most basic are food, water, warmth, rest. Right above that is security, safety. The third tier is intimate relationships and friends. Fourth tier is esteem, prestige, and feeling of accomplishment. And then the fifth tier is self-actualization. Right. So if you can provide the first two layers, physiological, food, water, warmth, rest, and security.
The rest is a result of freedom.
Exactly.
So securing those friendships and being able to have relationships that are enriching and nourishing, in order to feel that esteem. But you can't do that if those bottom ones are not met. And the question is, how do we meet those? Mm-hmm. And we would have said 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that's met with your community. And your community was your town of 150. And we've seen studies, basically people really can't have a social network outside of 150 people that's meaningful. That's why, and I think it's some Amish communities, once they hit a certain number, they actually insist on breaking apart, because you can't hold on to the community if it's above 150 or above 200. People stop knowing each other, right? So
I think Latter-day Saint churches do a similar thing. And
yeah, I think
as their wards grow, they go build a new ward because they don't want to have like a mega church where they have 3,000 people showing up, because I don't know anybody here.
But again, the social fabric that would make sure those bottom tier needs are met, as well as some of the relational needs are met, are things like small towns and your family, and outside your family is a church or a place of worship. And those things, when you fall on hard times, where do you go? You go to your family first. And then when your family isn't there or can't do it, then you go to that local community. Well, if you live in a big city of 5 million people and you aren't part of a close-knit community, that social fabric, then you are literally living alone among 5 million people. And the question is, how do we as a society, because we're not going to force everyone into different churches, how do we meet those needs when they're not being met in their communities?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Or they haven't voluntarily joined a community. And so you go to solutions that kind of the social safety net, people would say, is, well, we got to provide these things. I don't disagree that it needs to be provided somehow. I do disagree with the method, because I'm not sure that people like us who are middle class need to be paying the bill for those things. I'm not saying I'm unwilling to, but I don't think the burden should fall on us. So it's this tricky thing, you get into like Medicare or I guess single payer health insurance that's provided by the government. We see it in every first world nation except the United States. Well, there's drawbacks to it, obviously, but there's also some benefits we get from not engaging in that kind of system. Are we making ourselves better by not having it? Or are we preventing ourselves from actually making some important progress? It's hard to tell, because we see what happens when you give power to large bureaucracies in other countries is they can be abused. Mm-hmm. And that you never know who might be in charge next, right? Like every time that those who supported Trump were totally willing to let him do something outside of his powers, they're now screeching and hollering when Biden wants to do the same thing. Don't give power to an office when you're in charge, because the next time when you're not in charge, those powers will remain.
Sure.
That's a tricky thing. And so if you're going to create a bureaucracy that can make kinds of decisions that would take care of you, they can also make decisions that could harm you. And that, you have to be careful with that.
No, I agree, but it's interesting because you said in America, liberty is kind of top of the, mm-hmm. what do we value as a nation? And the preamble of the Constitution says, in order to form a perfect union, but eventually, and secure the blessings of liberty. So if the blessings of liberty are that self-actualization, mm-hmm. then how do we secure that? And, for the longest time, America's system, I would say right up until the 1900s was, here's this land, go stake your claim and make what you will of it. And largely we will ensure that you are safe, be it against foreign enemies or as you settle the land against the tribes of natives that we are forcing off their own land into reservations. But, we will secure your safe passage and stuff like that while we take away their land and their liberty. But that was it. That was kind of the extent of largely, and the securing the blessings of liberty. And then in the 1900s, that started to change as we industrialized more and urbanized more, and that we became less of an agrarian nation. And those questions came up. It's like, yeah, I got a job at a factory, but I don't have the blessings of liberty. I'm working unsustainable hours. My kid is working at the factory. I'm getting hurt, or my friend died. And I still don't make enough to provide a good life for my family. And so then that question came, it's like, well, how do we provide? And so then we said, well, let's introduce labor laws. And then after the Great Depression hit, then Roosevelt came in, and that's when Medicare and Medicaid, not Medicaid, but Medicare, Social Security, those things started to come into the forefront, where we said, no, we need to do more to take care of our people outside of giving them an opportunity to get a job or stake their claim. And now, as you mentioned, it's like it's kind of gone, do we want to go to that next step where we start socializing those bottom tier needs as far as food, water, shelter, rest, or not? Is there another way that we can secure that bottom tier that allows you to self-actualize. And it's funny because Dan Carlin said, almost as a throwaway away on one of his podcasts a couple of years ago, he goes, I tend to believe that the best way to have freedom is to make sure that people's needs are taken care of, and then they can go pursue the life that will satisfy them. And it was so like, he said it so just nonchalantly as he does. And it's just like, oh yeah, I guess I see where you're coming from. However, the point you make, Eric, and especially when it comes to the federal government, it's like, it's so big and it's so massive that it one runs basically by itself, but two can also be terribly abused, especially in the executive, depending on the person in that office, as we saw with Trump. But, he ain't the only one that's abused the presidency. So it is an interesting question. I don't know what the answer is. I would say more local government control, in the sense that I think state and local governments, because they are smaller by definition, are more efficient and are easier to hold to account because they are smaller. Whereas the national government is not.
Yeah, the local governments have a tendency to swing further in each direction.
That's true.
When they do. The federal government, there's parts of the federal government, I think, like you said, they run on their own. So when we went from George W. to Obama, there was a lot of promises in there about the war on terror coming to an end, about Guantanamo being closed, about all those kind of things.
Sure.
And what we saw over his eight-year presidency was a huge uptick in drone strikes and surges in soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like a lot of these big moves that did not jive with
which is interesting.
Well, so was that him, or was that the fact that the machine of the federal government operates on its own, and what the president is simply the human decider to turn left, turn right,
which is
or go
remarkable, which makes more remarkable that Trump made a deal with the Taliban to leave in 2020. And we can debate the merits of how he made that deal, and then that Joe Biden followed through with that deal in 2021 and actually ended the war. And it's remarkable that it happened because we thought it was going to end for 20 years. We thought, right. We didn't think we were going to be here for 20 years. Yeah. And Obama, as much as he said he wanted to end the war, like you said, he surged in 2010. He added more soldiers when we thought in 2008, we're like, well, we thought you were the guy that was going to end this. And so it shows you that the machine or the functions of the national government are almost inexorable. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I mean, no, because you need people who know how the thing works. They're the ones who operate it. How many people live in Virginia around Washington, D.C., who are basically, they are the federal government. And there's 535 people that we elect to go there and make the decisions. But then it's carried out by people who will do the work for 40 years. The Senate and the Congress create these committees and say, all right, well, here's the Armed Services Committees and here's the new direction from the committee, but then that's it. And then it goes even beyond that. The Joint Chiefs, they're the ones who, while they may have changed, those guys are there by rank. The president doesn't select the Joint Chiefs. So they're there. They've been there the whole time. Maybe some guys have retired, new guys have come in, but there's a continuity. And that's I guess, where we're kind of, which is good in one respect. Yeah, but it's also, it can be a problem in another. It doesn't matter who's really in the office at the time. We still do things the same way. Now, but going back to the needs is interesting because one of the things that the federal government does, I think, fantastically well is Social Security. I mean, it's been sending checks out fine for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can talk about how it's not going to be solvent, but that's not because the Social Security Administration is pilfering funds or spending recklessly. It's because our Congress is not doing their job and how they're funding it. But the Social Security system works fine, and Medicare, for all its warts, works perfectly fine. So the question isn't, could we expand Medicare, or could we make the child tax credits permanent? Yeah, we could, and they'd work fine. But it becomes more a question of, is that how we want to answer the social safety net question?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a better way to do that? Is there decentralization, or an interesting option that really came into the fore last year was UBI, is universal benefits, just giving people money and saying, all right, go take care of your business.
I mean,
I'm not saying it is the answer,
and I've changed my tune on that with some of my new understanding of, modern monetary theory. And we issue our own currency here in the United States. So we have absolute control about how much we want to have in circulation. And if we want to look at the deficit or the debt, rather than looking at it as debt, that is the federal government's investment into the American public. Well, that's one way to look at it. And if it can solve some problems, it's fine. There are some things that are true. You have to pull some out, or you will get inflation. And then that's the next question. Where do you pull it out? And usually Congress goes through this process where they say, here's this new bill that requires that's going to cost money. And here are the pay for us. Here's how we pay for it. When really it's not like that money is going directly. I mean, it's all in computers anyways. So we don't need the pay for us. We simply need to say, this money has to come out of the system somewhere through taxes. And it's not like when I pay my taxes, those go to pay for something. My money just disappears. Mm-hmm. It just disappears out of the system to prevent inflation from running rampant. And it's the amount of money in circulation. It's the actual number of inflation, and it's or the amount of money being taken out of taxes. And it's also where unemployment stands at any given moment. And those three things are tied together, and they work in a certain way. And that's where the balance has to happen. The tricky part is, where do you pull the money out? And everyone says, well, tax the rich. The wealth tax seems like a wildly ridiculous idea that you're going to tax something that somebody has over 10 years until it's gone. Doesn't make any sense. But if you're going to do an income tax, you simply have to follow the money. You put the money into the system somewhere, and it flows a direction. You just take it out at the end point.
Well,
which
it's
is
funny
probably going to be Amazon.
I think the value-added tax is something that America needs to adopt. But
that's interesting. I just don't understand it.
So
I've read about it multiple times. I'm like, it ends up just being taxed at the end, but at
so
every
pretty
level,
much every other country in the world does a value-added tax instead of a national sales tax.
They also do the metric system, and as I've seen in several posts on Facebook, we literally use anything before using the metric system.
I actually saw a really good video about why we don't use the metric system, and it actually made a lot of sense, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. But the value-added tax instead of a national sales tax where we say, all right, sales tax across the nation for anything sold in America will be 5%. Instead of that, you say, if a tree logging company goes into the woods, chops down a tree, and then sells it to a lumber yard, they sell it for a certain price, and that's taxed. The lumberyard then turns those trees into planks of wood. They've now added value. Mm-hmm. So if they bought the lumber for $100 or the tree for $100, and they added $10 of value, that $10 of added value is now taxed at 5% or whatever it is. Okay. So then they sell that wood to a furniture maker. The furniture maker adds more value. So now it's $125. Mm-hmm. That now additional $15 is taxed again. So anytime you add value to the product, the added value is taxed. So it's not $115 taxed. It's the 15 that gets taxed because that's the added value. And so each stage that these materials go through and become more valuable, that new added value gets taxed and goes to the government coffers. So it's an interesting way of the government getting money without just doing a straight income tax or a flat sales tax. And like I said, pretty much every other country in the world does it. We're the only ones that don't because we just don't like the idea of a national sales tax. And I'm sure there's drawbacks to it. It doesn't add costs from what I've seen. It doesn't like make cars more expensive because the costs are just built into the process of producing. Like,
I'd say, while I'm not a fan of taxes in general, I'd rather there be an income tax on individuals than taxes on corporations. And the reason I feel that, well, first of all, corporations are going to use a massive amount of money to find their way out of every tax anyways.
Well, this would be a way to tax a corporation without an income tax on a corporation.
Corporations, you make your profit. That's great. We want you to have that money so that you can reinvest it. That's the goal, that you take that money and you're like, we have a bunch of money. We can now hire more people. And in the income tax is, I think, a better way. Just because the other thing about corporate taxes is if you have a low corporate tax, it's going to attract people. States do this to each other all the time, where they draw businesses in by giving tax breaks. Like, you get a tax break, but you don't because you're not threatening to leave. Just do away with corporate taxes in general.
Sure.
And I mean, income taxes, then it's on individuals who are getting paid. Again, I don't necessarily agree with income tax, but if you want something that's simple and works across the board, I think that's better than corporate taxes, because corporate taxes you can abuse in a way where you can give a tax break to Amazon that does not need it, but you're still going to tax a mom and pop shop. And I think that shouldn't be happening. I don't think government should be lobbying businesses to come to them with lower taxes.
No, I agree with that. I think that's a grift. I don't necessarily agree with you on the not having corporate taxes, but I do agree that corporate tax policy is heavily abused in America, in that it does punish smaller corporations because, Amazon brings a lot more jobs and supposed benefit to a community than, mom and pop's hardware store. So I do agree with that. But it's interesting because the discussion we're having is on how do we provide these needs. And I mean, I think no matter what, and I don't know if people like to hear this, no matter what you pick, there's going to be some kind of government imposition to meet those needs. Now, if it's through economic policy, if it's through laws that either encourage or restrict certain behavior, in the type of economic policy you pick, it doesn't matter what it is. The federal government is going to have some sort of dictate to ensure those needs are met, be it, shelter, food, water, and rest. Now, in a truly free, like anarchic free society, the government would not have say in that. But we accept the government's involvement in Social Security and Medicare. And we go, yeah, that works fine. We're okay with that, providing for the needs of those who are retired or of low means. We're generally fine with that. We're also fine with local and state governments providing police protection and firefighters, which ensures our security and safety. And so I think in some regards, we've already accepted that the government can provide those needs. We just don't want them to overreach in how they provide those needs. And we definitely don't want them to make it economically punitive as much as we can to provide those needs.
One discussion I heard on the big government, small government thing, because generally I think in my past, kind of in my libertarian sensibilities again, is big government is bad, small government is better. Government small enough that you can drown it in the bath. But as somebody pointed out, you don't want it just to be small, and you don't want it just to not be big. You want it to fit the particular needs. You want it to be efficient. You want it to work. Sure. And if that requires it to be big, then it needs to be big. One case would be, it's probably good for the federal government to really scale up in 1941. You're going to need a lot of federal employees, say 5 million American soldiers, in order to take on the obstacle. It needs to be larger in that case, but effective. At the end of the war, well, the US government lost half of its employees at least. Why? Because we didn't need them. So it needs to be able to work for the needs.
Yeah, it needs to meet the moment.
When I've kind of leaned into the anarchic part of it, and I do appreciate some of the consistency there in terms of this is, if we're all left to do what we want, we will generally cooperate. And I think that's generally true. Most people just want to do what they want to do. However, that relies on one thing, and I think I brought this up when we talked about Starship Troopers, is that if we don't share common virtues, or we don't share common culture, it doesn't work out. If you and I are going to operate freely and we're going to freely associate, but you have wildly different virtues than I, then I can't rely on a baseline for us to communicate and share. And so the business dealings between us, you could be deceitful. And if I am unaware of that or am kind of not wise to it, then I can be taken advantage of. And I kind of lost that train of thought then. If we're trying to operate individually without and totally freely associate, and there's nothing in place to work our behavior other than social pressure, there's little accountability other than social pressure. And as we are not all living on farms with 3 acres each. Well, and one of the issues is we live in a society that's so interconnected that we have to have some ground rules and we have to have some systems in place to enforce them. And if you want to use social pressure to get people to not abuse each other, you're going to have to apply so much social pressure that by default, they're no longer free. I mean, it may not be the government dictating, that they're not free, but are you going to force everyone to be a good person? Because then you're eliminating their free will. And I think that's if we had no rules for things like, if there were no actual rules for slander and what's the other one? Libel. And false advertising, and some standards for how we communicate, how businesses communicate, what they can say in advertisements, who they can advertise to. If we didn't have any of those rules and we was completely open and free, and we had our current situation where the amount of information that's out there is out there, people would be taken in scams at a rate of 20 or 100 times more so than they are now. Yeah. Because it's nearly impossible as it is to really understand an article that might be posted to Facebook. And somebody on TikTok had this great stitch video where they discussed this. And he said, there's so much information out there. If I search for caffeine can make you go blind, I will find an article that backs up my point. And if I search for one that says coffee will improve your eyesight, I can find an article that backs that up. So while we tend to think we're educated and intelligent enough to tell the difference between good information and bad information or misinformation. We aren't, because Facebook is a good evidence for that. Can you imagine if businesses and publishers would not be held accountable ever for printing falsehoods?
Well, and a big part of the labor laws of the early 1900s that were instituted is because prior to this, America had a very laissez-faire government. And they said, no, businesses can basically do what they want. And we're not going to interfere with that because we don't want to interfere with business and our economy. Well, that led to a bunch of terrible things.
Yeah.
And so then the government, I think under Roosevelt with the Square deal, stepped in, and then it got expanded. Teddy Roosevelt and the Square deal, but that got expanded, eventually into the labor laws that we know today, and with OSHA and all that stuff, because people left to their own devices weren't looking out for each other. And
they tend not to. You are always going to seek out the best position for that which is closest to you, which first is you and then your close family. And everyone's going to do that. Everything's going to do it. Unions will do it. Corporations will do it. Legislators will do it. People being elected will do it. Your neighbor
will do it in the HOA. Like it's just part of who we are.
It's human nature, and human nature has not changed.
Yeah.
And we can try to educate it out, and that's somewhat effective. We can try to build virtues in, and that's somewhat effective. But you're always one generation away from losing those virtues, or as Reagan said, losing that democracy. So it needs to be taught, and it needs to be educated in. But humans are going to operate in that free way, and generally, I think that's good, because if I'm operating for my benefit, and you're operating for your benefit, and you and I could come to an agreement,
sure,
then it will be mutually beneficial. And if what I'm offering you is going to hurt you, then you're not going to take it.
Well, and I think
then that works. But when you scale that up, then you can have corporations that have no expiration date, B, are treated like a human, treated like a person,
the rights of a person.
Can also then donate can make political donations in amounts that are not on par with a person, can act more like not a person, but like an immortal superhuman. And it's like that. Sorry, that doesn't work. I think corporations are a great tool for actually distributing wealth to a lot of employees and building up new things. They're great. But I think there should be a death penalty for corporations that severely break the rules.
Sure.
Like, why not? If your corporation and what you do leads to the death of people knowingly, your corporation should be given the axe. It doesn't mean we execute anyone, but your corporation ceases to exist. Stocks drop to zero.
Assets are liquidated. Yeah.
And they should get the death sentence, and they should have no point in politics. And I think that's a good thing. And I've heard this recently on several podcasts where they discuss businesses wading in on social issues and political issues. It's like, I'm sorry, Coca-Cola. I give you my money because you sell something that tastes so sweet and good to me. And I know it's not good for me, but I'm willing to pay you.
Yeah.
But stop preaching to me something that I may or may not be interested in. I just want your sweet sugar water. That's all I want.
Well, and I think that's one. Yeah, 100%. But I
Pepsi,
think,
take a hike. Nobody likes
Pepsi,
you.
Come on, get out of here. And but I think it's interesting is we talk about freedom, and I don't know if we understand that freedom also requires responsibility, and I think so often we go, well, freedom means I can do what I want. It's like, well, sure, you can. You have the right to make any choice that you want, but those choices come with consequences, which is one thing that this country fails to understand, is that the choices we make have very real world consequences. And COVID probably being the most apparent example right now, but it's not just COVID. I mean, it's anything really, right? Like the trope, I thought this was America, right? That's something that's been going on for decades, where you think any silly behavior that you want to engage in doesn't have a consequence. But it does. But then the other part is there's a responsibility. If we're free, then we're basically saying we don't need someone else above us, the government, to tell us how to behave because we've got this. Well, if that's the case, then we need to live like we've got this. And then that requires us to look out for our fellow man. And now when we were primarily an agrarian society, that was a lot easier, Eric, right? Because you said the communities were smaller. You knew everybody in town. And so if somebody was down on their luck, it was personal. It was personal to you to help them as a community get back on their feet. And it doesn't mean everybody was more altruistic, but everybody knew everyone else. And so it was a lot harder to ignore the plight of your fellow man when you knew their name and you knew where they lived. And so we fail to kind of accept those other aspects of freedom, meaning there's consequences for your freedom, not just government or punitive, but there's just consequences for your choices. And there's a responsibility for you. If you're going to say we don't need an authority over us, then you need to behave as if you are being responsible not only for yourself and your family, but for those in your community, your neighbors. And it reminds me of Paul, and it's not 100% tied, but where Paul says in Romans 6, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? And I think a lot of people in this country think, well, because I'm free, I can make as many stupid choices as I want.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it's like, no, that's not the point. Like, because you're free doesn't mean you have a license to be stupid. It's because you're free, you have an opportunity to be better. And I think that's a perspective shift that we need. And so I think that's something that, go ahead.
So when you ask the question, what is the greatest country in the world? And when we say, well, we think it's America because we're free, it doesn't end there. No. We think it's America because we're free and because we hold that up as the highest ideal. Because we're free, we can also reach our greatest potential as individuals, of which is taking on the greatest responsibility for those around us. And because we're free, we can make the right choices of our own free will. Yeah. And not by coercion.
But it requires work. And I think that's the problem, is that we don't understand, and myself included. I'm not trying to like throw anyone else under the bus, but it's like, it requires work to be a better person. And it requires work to look out for your fellow man, and we hold to Judeo-Christian principles, if not the actual faith. Christ wasn't just calling on you to look out for number one. He was calling on you to help your brothers and sisters. And the story of who is your neighbor?
And that is tricky because we can see that. Yeah. And we can point to, well, he's not asking you to elect somebody to enforce that taking care of. He's
largely indifferent to the government. I mean,
he's telling you this is on you individually to go take care of these people because you are capable and you're probably endowed with some wealth or just the talent to take care of people. And it takes very little. What did it take the Samaritan? 30 minutes out of his day, probably longer, but didn't take much. And when we look at things like, and this is where it's tricky because you say, well, we shouldn't have too much regulation in business. And generally I'd agree because We want them to operate freely and make free association, and that should spur more prosperity in general. But when you get to a place in the early 1900s where people are regularly losing limbs in machines, and they're dying of these ulcers from different chemicals going through their feet, and children are working, and you have these terrible conditions, at some point you need to say, okay, this is, while we get that this fits in with the, you can do what you want, everyone gets to make the choices. Obviously, these employees came here of their own free will and made the choice to work here. This isn't working for the larger group. So how do we make a choice as a bunch of individuals in this situation, including the workers and the managers and the owners, to make sure that everyone's benefiting in a way that actually benefits everybody? How do we do that? Well, and one of the ways we do that is through regulation. Like, this isn't, and I think I mentioned this probably in a text message. Are we in a pendulum swing right now where we spent maybe 20, 30 years really, really pushing that pendulum, we can say, to the right, deregulation, letting businesses do whatever they want. And it's led to a ton of prosperity in terms of there's money in these businesses. But now we're getting to a point, there's nobody actually going back to work. Wages are stagnant. Production is through the roof, but wages have not caught up with that. Are we about to swing that pendulum back to the left where we say, okay, now it's time to get the workers and employees theirs? Is that where we are now? Is that what the next 10 to 15 years is going to look like, where we actually work towards making sure that the workers, the middle class, can now benefit from all of this?
I think that tension is always going to exist. And I think
it should always exist. I think that's
no. I agree. But I think you might be right. I mean, I think the past couple decades has been moving to the right on that swing. And I think it will start pulling back to the other side, to the left. But it's interesting, as you were talking, and maybe this is a good way to wrap it up, but I was thinking, comparing this to sports, and I think in my mind, the proper amount of regulation I would like in America, and we'll say with business, for example, is how they officiate soccer around the world. In that there's a ref, there's a set of rules, everybody knows the rules.
They're the simplest rules.
And if you step out of line, and if you do it, you get a little egregious, yellow card, red card, and that's it. But I think America, we're a little bit more like American football, where every year it's a spectacle on what rules are getting changed in the massive rule book that all the referees have to follow. Nobody knows what a catch is. Nobody.
And every foul has a long explanation.
Yeah.
It's going to be this and this many yards. And you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But that hit wasn't the same as a hit 2 plays ago that didn't get called.
And everybody hates the ref, which are the regulators in this scenario. Everybody hates the refs, no matter what call they make, because they're not letting us have any fun in the game. And I think that's too much regulation. That's more than I think is good for the country or good for the people.
Got to have a replay every few minutes.
But we do need to have rules. We do need to have a set of regulations or rules that the people can follow. They know what they are. They're clear and they are easily enforced. What that is in a practical sense is something that will always be debated, but we know it's there. We know what we want. It's just, how do we get there? I think is the question that people actually are debating. Not whether or not we should or shouldn't, but how much and how do we get there is really the questions that we're trying to answer here.
And in our form of government, it's always going to be too much and not quite enough, somewhere in the middle. Yeah. And in the end, it will be a dumpster fire of a bill, of a poorly written law that will be abused by anybody that can abuse it.
Yeah.
Because that's how we do things.
Well, because it'll have been lobbied for by Amazon and Coca-Cola. So, anyway.
Well, as long as people stop asking me, is Pepsi okay? Because it's not. I'm sorry, it's not. Pepsi's not okay.
Never has it been okay. So, but if they want to sponsor us.
That's why I always answer, is Pepsi okay? Fine. It's fine. Yeah. It's not okay. It's fine. But
yeah. All right. I think that wraps up this episode of Dad Bod After Dark.
See, who says we need prep work? We just went 2 hours with no prep.
I'm sure it's pure gold too.
Oh, it is.
So, all right. Well, on behalf of Eric, thank you guys for joining us. I'm Jake. We're Dad Bod History, and we'll see you all next time.